So I want to welcome you to the Center for Muslim Christian Understanding. I'm very excited to have our guest today, Dr. Fatima Fanusie, who's a 20th century U.S. historian. She did her undergraduate at Lincoln University in Pennsylvania and master's in U.S. history at Tufts University, and then a PhD in U.S. history here at in Washington, D.C. at Howard University. So she is a Washington, D.C. Are you originally from here?
Boston, Mass. Yeah.
Okay, but you're a native
Yeah, I've been
now.
here for a while, yeah.
It counts. And when I met her at the American Academy of Religion, I was very excited to have her come speak because the topic of her research is something that it's always been a question. I've never found an answer to, and books on Islam in America to get into a little bit, but none of them have been able to examine it in depth, and that's what her research does on the legacy of Fard Muhammad, his context and his identity even. And so she'll be speaking. She's going to speak for about half an hour, and then we can have question and answer. And we can go till about 1:30, 1:45. So we have plenty of time for Q&A. Please go ahead.
Okay. And I will stand just because I'm high energy. I would go crazy sitting there. Okay. So. Okay, so good morning or afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Okay. So my presentation today deals with the unique historical roots of the 20th century development of Islam in America and the pioneering role of Indian Ahmadiyya Muslims in this process. In his 1997 study, historian Richard Brent Turner identified Fard Muhammad as, quote, an Islamic modernist, missionary, and important voice in the noise of conflict about the boundaries of American religion and identity, end of quote. My research helps to clarify exactly how a significant percentage of African Americans began to identify themselves as Muslims during the early decades of the 20th century. Many of us are familiar with the Nation of Islam as a black nationalist movement in the United States with Islamic religious undertones. Some of us may know that the Nation of Islam was the primary vehicle by which most African Americans prior to 1975 were introduced to Islam. But very few of us understand how the Nation of Islam itself came to be or who Fard Muhammad was. In my doctoral research, I sought to examine just that, the intellectual and religious heritage of W.D. Fard Muhammad, the mysterious founder of the Nation of Islam. I was able to identify a 5-stage periodization for the growth of Islam in the United States. Writings by Ahmadiyya intellectuals illustrate that the Ahmadiyya used various strategies between 1888 and 1975 to spread Islam in America. The Ahmadiyya were a group who emphasized universalism as the most poignant trait of Islam and who loudly criticized their Sunni Orthodox contemporaries for clouding the universal nature of Islam in modernity. As early as 1888, one of this group's dire warnings was that, on its present track, Muslim societies were in danger of cultivating a radical and unhealthy interpretation of Islam in their mainstream. To this end, they insisted that jihad referred only to the battle of ideas to be waged with the pen, and that there was no room for the concept of a violent jihad in modern society. I have identified W.D. Fard Muhammad and the Nation of Islam as the fourth component of this 5-stage Ahmadiyya effort to develop Islam in the United States between 1880 and 1975. The fifth and final stage of this periodization began in 1959 when Professor Muhammad Abdullah was sent as a missionary to the United States by the Ahmadiyya Anjuman Islamiyya for the purpose of instructing the Honorable Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam leadership in Islam. 28 years earlier, Abdullah had arrived in the U.S. under the pseudonym W.D. Fard for the purpose of introducing Islam to this same population. After arriving in 1959, Muhammad Abdullah also traveled to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, to meet with W.D. Fard's namesake, the young minister W.D. Muhammad. This meeting cemented a friendship which would fulfill the goals of a small band of Muslim intellectuals formed a century earlier in the Punjab region of northern India. So the first stage was between 1880 and 1902, and this is what I call the conception and literary campaign. The Ahmadiyya movement was an organization of Muslim modernists and missionaries established by Mirza Ghulam Ahmad in 19th century British India. From its inception, the group's purpose was twofold: to, quote, protect and defend Islam internally and externally, and to think out ways and means to propagate Islam in Europe and North America, end of quote. Between 1888 and 1902, Ahmed and his supporters embarked upon a literary campaign to just these ends through personal correspondence with Americans and Europeans through letters written into American and European journals. The Ahmadiyya were targeting enlightened thinkers and truth seekers of both societies, believing these groups to be ripe for conversion to Islam and in a position as elites to effect religious development in their societies. As a result of the inaugural World Parliament Conference on Religion, the conversion to Islam of U.S. diplomat Russell Alexander Webb, and general interest in the American religious media at this time, Ahmadiyya strategists were excited and hopeful about bringing Islam to Americans. In support of the decision to cultivate Islam in the Christian West, one Ahmadiyya writer wrote, "The trend of European thought is toward Islam. Unconsciously and unintentionally, the Western world has become Muslimized. They are moving in the groove towards the teachings of the Quran." The second phase was from 1902 to 1920. During this phase, the Ahmadiyya established two of their own English literary journals to further their work of introducing Islam to Americans and Europeans, the Review of Religions and the Islamic Review. During this second phase, they sent missionary Khawaj Kamaluddin to England. As editor of the Islamic Review and a respected member of elite British religious, spiritual, and intellectual circles, Kamaluddin experienced immediate success in converting a modest number of influential Europeans to Islam. At the same time, the Ahmadiyya movement split into two, with the larger group referred to by outsiders as the Qadiani and the smaller faction known as the Ahmadiyya Anjuman Ishat Islamiyya, or the Lahore Ahmadiyya. The Qadian Ahmadiyya chose to emphasize the particularistic currents in Ahmadiyya thought, while the Lahore Ahmadiyya emphasized the universal aspects of Ghulam Ahmad's teachings. The Lahore Ahmadiyya were less visible than their counterparts and used their invisibility to act as an unseen hand affecting Islamic development from behind the scenes. In their emphasis on universalism, the Lahore did not want to spread Ahmadiyya Islam or even Sunni orthodoxy. Rather, they wanted to bring truth to societies where falseness reigned and to, quote, further the cause of righteousness, purity, piety, and moral excellence throughout the world, end of quote. The strategy of the Lahore Ahmadiyya up to this time was to emphasize Islam's compatibility with modern science and rational thought at a time when Europeans were questioning the rationality of Trinitarian Christianity. The Lahore Ahmadiyya invited, cajoled, and admonished American and European thinkers to accept Islam or to accept the logic of the Quran to clean up their own religious beliefs. Despite the successful circulation of their free scholarly journals, few, if any, Americans converted to Islam during this time period. This brings us to the third phase of direct Ahmadiyya involvement with American religious society, and phase 3 runs from 1920 to 1930. In 1920, the Qadian Ahmadiyya sent the first missionary to America, Mufti Muhammad Sadiq. And I want to emphasize that this was the first, open missionary, but that they had sent others prior to this time. The accepting mood foreshadowed by the 1896 inaugural World Parliament Religions Conference in America had since been replaced by a more rabid and hostile racism. In fact, Sadiq was detained by immigration and jailed for 7 weeks upon arrival in response to the Asian Exclusion Act. A Supreme Court case decision against an Indian American similarly excluded Asian Americans from the benefits of first-class American citizenship. In 1921, Sadiq established the Muslim Sunrise, the first Ahmadiyya publication in America to further promote Islam. Their efforts, however, were a failure. Between 1920 and 1930, the Ahmadiyya made just 1,025 converts to Islam, and none of them were from among the originally targeted audience. Most of these new converts were African American Southern migrants to the north. The Ahmadiyya were outraged and their strategy to spread Islam as the solution for the spiritual seeker and enlightened thinker was now replaced with an obsession to overturn American racism. Embittered, Ahmadiyya strategists employed satire as a tool in the crusade to dismantle American racism. They pointed to the hypocrisy of a Protestant Christian culture which upheld the doctrine of white supremacy and prevented freedom, justice, and equality for non-whites in American society. Muhammad Ali, Sadr Khan, and other members of the Lahore intelligentsia began to emphasize the historic uses of syncretism as a strategy for religious development in hostile societies. They pointed especially to the era of an emerging rabbinical class and how Jewish strategists had employed religious syncretism by creating a Trinitarian language for Christianity in order to convert pagan Roman overlords to monotheism. Ahmadiyya Muslims similarly emphasized in their writings how medieval-era Sufi saints and Muslim mystics had converted illiterate Hindu peasants to a nominally Islamic identity by juxtaposing Islamic names and events over Hindu names and celebrations in a process where a true Islamic identity actually took centuries to unfold. Finally, Muhammad Ali and his supporters began studying the successes and failures of non-Christian Asian movements attempting to establish their religion among Americans. The most notable example was the American Baha'i movement, which Muhammad Ali devoted a book-length study to, where he emphasized that Baha'i missionaries had to develop a syncretistic form of their original message in order to make the Bab's teachings palatable to American Christians. Ali Riley noted that with the exception of the Unitarians, Americans were only receptive to religious ideas couched in Trinitarian language. Yet this very language had the tendency to lead the people right back to the same Christianity they had started with. At the close of this phase, embittered Lahore Ahmadiyya writers were identifying white supremacist ideology as the single obstacle to the progress of Islam in the United States. Increasingly, their writings emphasized the unique aspects of Ahmadiyya eschatology, particularly their understanding of religious symbolism and its divinely sanctioned role in spiritual development. In the pages of the Islamic Review, Sher Ali explained God's method justly. Quote, "Past experience has taught us that it is a fatal error to insist on a literal fulfillment of every word of prophecy. God's mode of revealing coming events is very often figurative. He most often makes use of symbols for the expression of his thoughts. He seldom discloses a thing wholly. He almost always reserves a part of it. It must be remembered that it is God's method to hide a great secret of his providence until men are able to bear it. The searching after it itself becomes a part of their discipline. The true witness does not thus come to the world in broad daylight, for the world is not prepared for such an event." End of quote. Between 1880 and 1930, the Ahmadiyya pioneered Islamic missionary work in Europe and America. In America, all Islamic and proto-Islamic development was linked to the Ahmadiyya movement during this time. This included Muhammad Alexander Russell Webb, Marcus Garvey and the UNIA, Noble Ali and the Moorish Science Temple of America, and Professor Alzuddin's Adenu Alahi Universal Arabic Association. Still, by the end of the 1920s, Ahmadiyya strategists were aware that their forthright and sincere efforts to bring Americans to Islam had failed. They were convinced that American racism was the reason. Bitterly denouncing the hard-headedness of the American religious elite they had been so enamored with for 2 decades, Lahore Ahmadiyya writers warned Americans in their journals that they understood their trickery, their deceit, and the corruption of God's word and Christ's message. Decrying the pseudo-scientific justification for the white supremacy mantle upholding American racism, embittered Ahmadiyya began writing degradingly of the, quote, European cavey, end of quote, living in bestial conditions while civilization had blossomed in Asia and Africa. Seething with indignation when American missionaries convened a conference on the danger of Islam to the Africans, one Ahmadiyya article accused Christianity as coming to non-white populations, quote, as the religion of adventurers who, bearing their Christian names, have despoiled them or tricked them out of their lands, have exploited their minds, used their labors, have ruined them with strong drinks, have treated them with roughness, scorn, and barbarity. Christians are great inventors. So extraordinary is their genius for invention that they have invented even a God of their own. End of quote. Finally, they ushered the following plea directly to African Americans. My dear American Negro, Assalamu alaikum. Peace be with you and the mercy of Allah. The Christian profiteers brought you out of your own native lands of Africa, and in Christianizing you made you forget the religion and language of your forefathers, which were Islam and Arabic. You have experienced Christianity for so many years, and it has proved to be no good. It is a failure. Christianity cannot bring real brotherhood to the nations. So now, leave it alone. And join Islam, the real faith of universal brotherhood. You need a religion which teaches manliness, self-reliance, self-respect, and self-effort. End of quote. The Lahore Ahmadiyya strategy shift did not go unnoticed by American religious thinkers. In fact, at least one American theologian studied the movement in its entirety, concisely summarizing Ahmadiyya history, goals, and activities from 1880s through 1929. In an article on the Ahmadiyya movement's Western propaganda, published in a 1929 volume of the Harvard Theological Review, Dr. James Addison Taylor warned his colleagues that the Lahore branch of the Ahmadiyya movement was comprised of devious intellectuals who would stop at nothing to plant Islam in Christian societies. In pointing to the specific threat which Lahore Ahmadiyya intelligentsia embodied, Thayer gave an analysis of the group as manipulators who relied upon subtle techniques and conniving methods to implant Islam in Europe and America. Accordingly, he called out the Ahmadiyya Anjuman Ishat Islamiyya writers by name, accusing them of responding to Jewish and Christianary mission techniques with strategies rooted in deception. Particularly offended by the AAII literary works, which encouraged the blending of Islamic ideals with popular religious and social culture of target populations, Thayer wrote, in contrast with the Qadian sect, the Lahore group, as we have seen, is reluctant to admit any connection with the Ahmadi movement. Its leaders, especially in England, are eager to adapt their message to the convictions or the fashions of the present hour, and to exploit the ignorance of the audience by making any assertions that will favor their case. Intellectually more acceptable than the Qadiani, they inspire less respect, for one usually prefers the naive and narrow-minded to the sophisticated and slippery. This brings us to the fourth phase, Fard Muhammad, 1930 to 1933. Fard Muhammad's effort to cultivate an Islamic-oriented organization was successful where his Ahmadiyya predecessors had failed, precisely because he formed a syncretistic religious movement designed to stimulate Islamic growth within the framework of American religious culture. The increasingly racist development of American religion and culture between 1900 and 1930 provided the impetus for Fard's departure from the standard Ahmadiyya approach of enticing enlightened American thinkers with a clear, rational picture of Islam. In a final bid to cultivate an Islamic population in America, Fard developed a religious syncretism that would appeal to an undereducated black Christian underclass. In 1907, Levi H. Dowling's The Aquarian Gospel of Jesus the Christ introduced the Aquarian age to America by giving an esoteric account of Jesus' life. Contemporary journalist of the time, Riley observed that supernatural ideas, packaged with the right finesse and exotic appeal, could count upon attracting the modernized, secular, and scientific thinker as well. Midwestern centers such as Chicago and Detroit exploded with the occult and esoteric ideas, as did the western states of California, Oregon, Washington, Nevada, and Arizona. By the 1920s, mass marketing techniques had allowed New Age sects to launch campaigns on a national level. While most American mystical movements during the first 3 decades of the 20th century were syncretistic amalgams of esoteric Western cults or occult movements, Eastern spiritual traditions, and Christian mysticism, many still identified as Christian in religious outlook and worldview. Still, the syncretistic nature of these organizations is relevant to our own understanding of what Fard Muhammad encountered and how he fashioned his own Islamic syncretistic movement in the same geographical region and at the same moment in history. One of the more popular movements during this time was Guy Ballard's Mighty I Am, whose beliefs were published under the revealing title of Unveiled Mysteries. In a manner similar to the Theosophical Society's Isis Unveiled, Ballard's publication promised to initiate the new member into the hidden truths of the universe. Fard similarly adopted the paraphernalia and culture of the esoteric and exotic cult in order to lead his followers not to the mysteries of the Orient or India, but to the wisdom of the Quran. Thus, the fantastic aspects of Fard's creed and mythology must be examined as a syncretistic religious development of Islam that had been carefully designed to flourish within the milieu of religious and spiritual culture in early 20th century American society. With an in-depth understanding of the emergence of the Baha'i movement, Fard was equipped to craft a syncretistic movement capable of affecting disaffected American Christians. Although most researchers into the history of the Nation of Islam have misread Fard's strategy, Peter Jenkins recognized the Islamic missionary syncretistic approach. In Mystics and Messiahs, Cults and New Religions in American History, Jenkins argues that Fard used, quote, the Bible as a mean of introducing his new religious teachings until disciples could be brought to full knowledge of the true word of God, the Quran, end of quote. This approach is in accord with Ahmadiyya intellectuals' belief that non-literate masses were generally not limited. This approach is in accord with Ahmadiyya intellectuals' belief that non-literate masses were generally not initiated into the esoteric meaning of religious scripture. The cornerstone of Fard's strategy was a metaphorical reading of scripture. From its 1930 initiation, W.D. Fard instructed members and supporters of the Temple of Islam not to engage in a literalist reading of the Bible or Christian doctrine, warning that both must be understood as a symbolic language to be interpreted rather than followed literally. Fard used a logic gleaned from his Ahmadiyya reading of the Quran to underlie the Bible-based language of the Temple of Islam. While insisting that the Bible cannot be interpreted literally, Fard nonetheless replaced a literalist reading of the Bible with his own fantastic mythology, a mythology reminiscent of an oft-repeated theme in the English-language Ahmadiyya journals, the Review of Religions and the Islamic Review. And that was the successful use of religious syncretism as a conversion tool throughout human history. Fard's doctrine was outlined in a series of catechisms which had to be memorized by all new members. In the student enrollment, Fard posed and answered the following question: who is the original man? Answer: the original man is the Asiatic black man, the maker, the owner, the cream of the planet Earth, father of civilization, God of the universe. End of quote. In English Lesson C1, the question is asked of the black American initiate: what is his own self? Answer: his own self is a righteous Muslim. Question: are there any Muslims other than righteous? Answer: I beg your pardon, I have never heard of one. Within this Islamic identity, Asiatic ethnicity and blackness were assigned special status. Fard appealed to an identity crisis that neither Christianity nor the emerging African American popular culture had been able to completely ease. The ability to connect African Americans historically with an African Muslim ancestry provided a powerful psychological antidote to address their psyche as an oppressed group within American society. When illuminated within the context of the Ahmadiyya intelligentsia, Fard's emphasis on the Muslim identity is more readily identifiable as a satirical commentary on the doctrine of white supremacy, which American Protestant culture had yet to unequivocally rebuke and in many instances unabashedly upheld. Although the clandestine nature of his mission precluded Fard from making overt reference to Ahmadiyya beliefs, his approach was nonetheless rooted in Ahmadiyya missionary tradition and intellectual heritage. Fard established a new identity for African American converts as righteous Muslims, not Christian. He taught them that the Bible was a poison book. At the same time, Fard taught them to read it critically. just as the Ahmadiyya similarly rejected biblical literalism. Furad's early stipulation to bring 4 devil's heads and the notion of the white man as devil, etc., must all be interpreted through the esoteric thinking of Ahmadiyya Muslims. The Ahmadiyya taught an understanding of man as mind. Furad taught that the white man was the devil that had to be killed, with white symbolizing the pollution of white supremacy. Furad stated that the white man or white supremacist mindset could not be converted to Islam because his, Furad's, successors had already attempted to convert them, but that they had stubbornly clung to their traditions. Finally, Furad taught that the reward for the student was the Holy Quran. After intensive tutorial for 3 years, Furad departed, leaving his protege, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, in charge of the movement. Exiting from California, Furad returned to Fiji by the way of the Pacific, where he worked as an educator, known and venerated among the Fiji Indian migrant working class as Master Muhammad Abdullah. Both his satire and his overarching goal can be clearly identified within the historic context of efforts to cultivate Islamic development among non-Muslim populations and the contemporary reality of Muslims facing European colonization and missionary efforts to an unprecedented degree between 1860 and the 1931 founding of the Allah Temple of Islam. Furad was successful in planting an Islamic identity among African American Southern migrants because he utilized the Christian paradigm they were familiar with in order to convince them that Islam was the appropriate religion for the original man. This brings us to the 5th and final phase, 1959 to 1975. Muhammad Abdullah returned to the United States to finish the work started years earlier. The Nation of Islam had survived and retained its nominal identity as Muslims. Abdullah began to work closely with the chosen successor to the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, Minister Wallace D. Muhammad, who was taught Arabic and Quran as a child. During this time, Muhammad Abdullah worked in relative obscurity, in contrast to his Ahmadiyya missionary counterparts, whose mission and work was touted far and wide in Ahmadiyya literary publications, as well as non-Ahmadiyya journals and newspapers. Abdullah forged a close relationship with the young Wallace Muhammad, and continued to work closely with the Nation of Islam leadership until 1975. Imam Muhammad solved the riddles embedded in the Nation of Islam doctrine, winning the promised reward of the Quran both literally and figuratively. W.D. Muhammad successfully established a community of Muslims in America who are part of the global Muslim Ummah, yet not confined by the psychological limitations which had confounded Sunni orthodoxy. Imam W.D. Muhammad's leadership and teachings, a model for Muslims in America and throughout the world, has fulfilled those aspirations of Ahmadiyya Indian Muslims over a century ago, so faithfully concerned with restoring Islam to its intended position as a universal way of life among those committed to human dignity, freedom, and moral excellence. Thank you.